The shuttle smelled like recycled air and nervous sweat. Annie Reyes pressed her forehead against the cold window and watched Station Meridian 7 grow larger against the black emptiness of space. She was 23 years old, born in a small town in Montana, and she was about to become one of the few humans ever accepted into the Galactic Federation Combat Academy. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. It was old leather, cracked in places, with faded stitching that her grandmother had repaired dozens of times over 40 years. The bag looked like it belonged in a museum, not on a space station where everything was made of smooth metal and glowing screens. The shuttle docked with a soft thump. Annie stood up and joined the line of recruits moving toward the exit. She was the smallest person on the shuttle. The Vorthani warriors ahead of her stood nearly 8 feet tall, their blue-gray skin covered in natural armor plating. Behind her, a group of Pelcari scouts chittered to each other in their clicking language, their forearms folded across their narrow chests. Even the young Grundothi soldier beside her, who seemed barely adult by his species standards, towered over her by at least 2 feet. Annie stepped onto the station and immediately felt the weight of 100 stares. "Is that a human?" someone whispered. "Look at what she is carrying," another voice said louder. "What is that thing?" Annie kept walking. She had heard worse back home. Being small and quiet in a world that valued big and loud had taught her patience, but a Vorthani recruit blocked her path. He was massive, his jaw plates clicking as he looked down at her with 4 yellow eyes. His name tag read Dren in Federation standard script. "Little human," Dren said, his voice booming through the corridor. "Did you bring your grandmother's garbage bag to combat training?" Laughter erupted around her. Annie felt her face grow warm, but she did not look away. "Yes," she said simply. "I did." More laughter. Dren seemed disappointed that she did not cry or run away. He stepped aside with a dismissive wave of his massive hand. "Humans," he muttered. "Soft little creatures playing at being soldiers." Annie found her assigned bunk in the recruit barracks. It was a small room, barely big enough for the bed and storage unit. She sat down and placed the bag on her lap, running her fingers over the worn leather. Her grandmother had carried this bag through the Rocky Mountains for 40 years. She had used it to survive 3 days lost in a blizzard. She had used it to rescue hikers, hunters, and lost children. 217 lives saved, all because of what she carried in this simple bag. Grandma Betty had died 2 years ago. Cancer. Nothing in the bag could fix that. But before she passed, she had pressed the bag into Annie's hands and said, "Take this with you. Everything you need is inside. Not just the tools, the knowledge. Remember what I taught you." Annie opened the bag and checked the contents for the 100th time. Handmade rope, strong enough to hold 3 times her weight. A steel knife that her grandmother had sharpened so many times the blade was half its original width. Waterproof matches in a sealed tin. Fishing line and hooks. Water purification tablets. A compact first aid kit. A wool blanket that could keep a person warm in freezing temperatures. Dried meat wrapped in cloth. And her grandmother's journal, filled with 40 years of survival notes, hand-drawn diagrams, and hard-earned wisdom in O batteries. No circuits, nothing that could break or malfunction. A chime sounded through the station, followed by a deep voice. "All recruits report to Orientation Hall 7. Instructor Kolveth will brief you on tomorrow's survival assessment." Annie closed the bag and stood up. She had heard about Instructor Kolveth. He was a Grundothi veteran with 30 years of combat experience. He had trained thousands of recruits from dozens of species. He had never passed a human candidate. Not once in 3 years. The orientation hall was enormous, filled with recruits from 12 different star systems. Annie found a spot near the back and waited. Instructor Kolveth walked onto the raised platform at the front of the hall. He was old for a Grundothi, his natural armor scarred and pitted from decades of battle. His eyes swept across the crowd like searchlights, pausing briefly on Annie before moving on. "Tomorrow begins your survival assessment," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. 72 hours in a simulated hostile environment. Multiple biomes. Predators. Environmental hazards. You will be dropped alone and expected to survive. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the nervous recruits. "Many of you will fail. Some of you will be eliminated within the first hour. This assessment will show us who belongs at this academy and who should go home." His eyes found Annie again. The Federation believes in giving every species a chance, even the soft ones, even the weak ones. But this academy does not lower its standards for anyone. Annie met his gaze without flinching. She had faced down grizzly bears in the Montana wilderness. She had survived nights so cold that her breath froze in the air. She had learned to read the land, the weather, and the animals before she learned to read books. She was not soft. She was not weak. She was her grandmother's legacy. And tomorrow, she would prove it. 30 species stood in the simulation bay, and not one of them looked at Annie Reyes with anything but pity. She could feel their eyes on her back as she adjusted the strap of her old leather bag. The Vorthani recruit named Dren whispered something to his friends, and they all laughed in that deep, rumbling way that made the floor vibrate. Instructor Kolveth stood on the central platform, his scarred armor catching the harsh lights. Behind him, massive screens showed the simulation environment, a sprawling landscape of jungles, deserts, mountains, and frozen tundras. Somewhere in that digital wilderness, hungry things waited. You will each receive a standard Federation survival kit, Kolveth announced. A line of silver cases slid out from the wall on a conveyor belt. Inside you will find emergency rations, a multi-tool, a medical scanner, a beacon for extraction if you choose to surrender, and a portable shelter unit. Recruits moved forward to collect their kits. Annie stayed where she was. "Instructor," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. The hall went quiet. "Permission to use my own equipment." Kolveth turned to look at her. His eyes moved from her face to the bag hanging at her side. For a moment, something flickered across his expression, curiosity, perhaps, or disbelief. "Your own equipment," he repeated slowly. "Yes, sir." Dren laughed out loud. "She wants to use that antique." "Instructor, this is a combat academy, not a history museum." Other recruits joined in the laughter. Kolveth raised one massive hand, and silence fell immediately. "Recruit Reyes," he said. "The Federation Survival Kit represents the most advanced portable technology in 12-star systems. It has kept soldiers alive in conditions that would kill most species in minutes. And you wish to replace it with?" He gestured at her bag. "That." "Yes, sir." "What?" Annie met his gaze steadily. "Because I know what is in my bag. I know how every item works. I know it will not break." Kolveth stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, his mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. "Granted," he said. "Use your bag, Recruit Reyes. When you fail within the first hour, it will serve as a useful lesson for the other humans who come after you." More laughter. Annie simply nodded and stepped back. The recruits were loaded into individual drop pods. Annie strapped herself in and felt the familiar kick of acceleration as the pod launched into the simulation. Through the small window, she watched the landscape rush up to meet her, green and dense and alive. The pod hit the ground hard. Annie unstrapped herself and kicked open the hatch. Humid air rushed in, thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and something else, something musky and dangerous. She had landed in the jungle biome. Good, she thought. Jungles were survivable if you knew what you were doing. She opened her bag and took quick inventory. Everything was there, exactly as she had packed it. She pulled out her grandmother's journal and flipped to the section on tropical environments. Her grandmother had never been to space, had never seen an alien jungle, but the principles were the same. Water, shelter, food, fire. In that order. Annie found a stream within 20 minutes. She tested the water with her purification tablets and filled her canteen. Then she moved upstream, looking for higher ground where she could build a shelter without worrying about flooding. Back in the monitoring station, Instructor Kolveth watched dozens of screens showing different recruits in different biomes. Most were struggling. The Federation survival kits were designed for emergency situations, not extended wilderness survival. The portable shelters drained their power cells quickly. The medical scanners gave information but could not treat injuries. The multi-tools were useful but required knowledge that most recruits did not have. On screen 17, a Pelcari recruit had already triggered his extraction beacon. On screen 23, a Vorthani was trying to eat something that was definitely poisonous. On screen 31, 2 Grundathi recruits were fighting over a water source. And on screen 44, Annie Reyes was building a shelter from branches and leaves, her movements quick and confident. Kolveth leaned closer to the screen. The human had already secured water, started a fire, and was now weaving a roof that would keep her dry in the jungle rains. She worked without hesitation, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. She probably had as the sun set in the simulation. Annie finished her shelter and settled in for the night. She ate a small portion of her dried meat and listened to the sounds of the jungle around her. Creatures called to each other in the darkness. Somewhere far away, something roared. Annie smiled and closed her eyes. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. The wilderness is not your enemy, Annie. It is a test. Pass the test, and it will let you live. Fail, and it will kill you. But it is always fair. Remember that. In the monitoring station, Kolveth watched the humans sleep peacefully while half his other recruits trembled in fear, unable to rest. He said nothing, but his eyes stayed on screen 44 longer than any other. Something was different about this one, that's something unexpected. 36 hours into the assessment, and the jungle had already claimed 17 recruits. Annie Reyes crouched beside a stream, refilling her canteen, when she heard something crashing through the undergrowth behind her. She was on her feet in an instant, knife in hand. The crashing grew louder, accompanied by heavy breathing and a string of words in a language she did not understand. Then the bushes parted, and Drin the Vorthani stumbled into the clearing. That he looked terrible. His blue-gray skin was covered in scratches, and one of his 4 arms hung at an odd angle. His Federation survival kit was gone, probably dropped somewhere in panic. His eyes were wild with fear and exhaustion. When he saw Annie, he froze. "You," he said. His voice was hoarse. "The human with the garbage bag." Annie lowered her knife, but did not put it away. "What happened to you?" Drin collapsed against a tree, his massive body sliding down until he sat in the mud. "Predators. Pack hunters. They took my kit, scattered my supplies. I have been running for 6 hours." He looked at her with a mixture of shame and desperation. "My water ran out yesterday. I cannot feel my left arm." Annie studied him for a moment. In a competition, the smart move was to leave him. He had mocked her, laughed at her, called her weak. He was her competitor, and every recruit who failed improved her own chances of passing. But Annie was not raised to think that way. "Let me see your arm," she said. Drin stared at her. "Why would you help me?" "Because you need help." Annie knelt beside him and examined his injured arm. It was dislocated, not broken. Painful, but fixable. "This is going to hurt." Before Drin could respond, she grabbed his arm and pulled sharply. There was a wet pop, and Drin roared in pain. But when the roar faded, he could move his fingers again. "What did you do?" he asked, flexing his arm in wonder. "Put it back in the socket." Annie opened her bag and pulled out her first aid kit. She cleaned his scratches with antiseptic and wrapped the worst ones with bandages. Then she handed him her canteen. "Drink. Small sips. If you drink too fast after dehydration, you will get sick." Drin drank, following her instructions. When he handed the canteen back, his eyes had changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by confusion. "I do not understand," he said. "We are competitors. Helping me makes no sense." Annie sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Where I come from, you do not leave someone to die just because they laughed at your bag. But I was cruel to you." "Yes, you were." Annie packed her first aid kit back into the bag. "And maybe tomorrow you will be cruel again. But right now, you are hurt and scared and alone. I have what you need. So I help. That is how humans do things." Drin was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he shook his massive head. "Your species is very strange," he said. "We have heard that before." They made camp together that night. Annie showed Drin how to build a fire without technology, how to purify water, how to identify which plants were safe to touch. He listened with the focus of a soldier learning a new weapon, asking questions that showed he was smarter than his earlier mockery had suggested. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked as they sat by the fire. Annie pulled out her grandmother's journal and held it carefully. The pages were worn soft from decades of use, filled with drawings and notes in her grandmother's steady handwriting. "My grandmother," she said. "She was a wilderness guide back on Earth. She spent 40 years walking through mountains and forests, rescuing people who got lost. She saved over 200 lives with what she carried in this bag." 200 lives, Drin repeated slowly. "With primitive tools. They are not primitive. They are reliable." Annie traced her finger over a drawing of a snare trap. "Technology is wonderful when it works. But my grandmother always said that the wilderness does not care about your equipment. It only cares about what you know. And what you know cannot be broken or lost or stolen. In the monitoring station, Instructor Kolveth watched screen 44 with growing unease. The human had not only survived, she was thriving. And now she was teaching a Vorthani warrior, one of the proudest species in the Federation, like he was a child. The other monitors showed continuing chaos. Recruits argued over resources. Recruits abandoned each other. Recruits made foolish mistakes that the jungle punished without mercy. But on screen 44, two former enemies sat by a fire, sharing food and knowledge. Kolveth had trained soldiers for 30 years. He had seen courage and cowardice, strength and weakness. But he had never seen anything quite like this. He pulled up Annie's file and began to read. Birthplace, Montana, Earth. A region known for extreme temperatures, large predators, and difficult terrain. Population, sparse. Resources, limited. Survival rate for lost travelers without proper preparation, very low. And yet the humans there had lived for thousands of years before developing any advanced technology at all. Kolveth closed the file and looked back at screen 44. For the first time in 3 years, he began to wonder if he had been wrong about humans. Night fell over the jungle like a heavy blanket. Annie Reyes heard the creature before she saw it. A low rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the trees and into her bones. Drin was on his feet instantly, his forearms raised in a fighting stance. Shadestalker, he whispered. They are the apex predators of this simulation. They have killed 12 recruits already. Annie stood slowly, her hand finding her knife. Through the gaps in the leaves, she could see something massive moving in the darkness. It was shaped like a nightmare. 6 legs, a body covered in black scales, and a head that seemed to be nothing but teeth. We need to run, Dren said. His voice trembled despite his efforts to control it. No, Annie grabbed his arm. Running is the worst thing we can do. It is an ambush predator. If we run, it will chase us. It is faster than us. It will catch us. Then what do we do? Annie pulled out her grandmother's journal. Her hands were steady even though her heart was pounding. She flipped to a section near the back, pages filled with notes about predator behavior. My grandmother never saw an alien, Annie said quietly. But predators are predators. They follow patterns. Watch how it moves. The Shadestalkers circled their small clearing. It did not charge. It waited, patient and still, only its massive head tracking their movements. It wants us to panic, Annie whispered. It wants us to run so it can chase. That is how it hunts. Fear is its weapon. She reached into her bag and pulled out her waterproof matches and a coil of rope. Working quickly, she gathered dry leaves and small branches. What are you doing? Dren asked. Making fire. Fire confuses predators. The light hurts their night vision. The smoke masks our scent. Annie struck a match and touched it to the pile of leaves. Flames licked upward, casting dancing shadows across the clearing. The Shadestalker stopped circling. Its head turned toward the fire, and for the first time, it looked uncertain. Annie took the burning bundle and walked toward the creature. Dren made a strangled sound of fear behind her. Annie stopped. She did not stop. She walked forward, holding the fire in front of her like a shield. The Shadestalker backed away one step, then another. Its rumbling growl became higher, almost confused. You do not know what I am, Annie said to it, her voice calm and steady. You have never hunted anything like me. I am from Earth. My ancestors survived ice ages and famines and predators much bigger than you. I am not your prey. She was close enough now to see its eyes, 8 of them, black as space, reflecting the firelight. The creature stared at her for a long moment. Then it turned and disappeared into the jungle. Annie let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. Her legs felt weak, but she did not let herself fall. She walked back to the clearing, where Dren stood frozen in shock. How did you know that would work? He asked. I did not know for certain, Annie admitted. But my grandmother always said that confidence is half of survival. If you act like prey, you become prey. If you act like a predator, sometimes the real predators get confused. They did not sleep that night. Instead, they kept the fire burning and watched the darkness. As dawn approached, they heard sounds of movement in the jungle. Not predators this time, but other recruits that a Pelcari scout named Scylla stumbled into their clearing. She was young, barely an adult by her species standards, and her 4 arms were wrapped around herself in fear. "Please," she said. "Please, I heard the Shade Stalker. I thought it would kill me. I saw your fire. Come sit down," Annie said. "When did you last eat?" Behind Scylla came a young Grundothi named Borith. His armor was scratched and dented, and he moved with a limp. "I followed her," he said. "My kit stopped working. The medical scanner died. I do not know how to treat my injury." Annie looked at these aliens who had come to her for help. A month ago, she had been a small human from a small town, invisible and insignificant. Now she was surrounded by warriors and scouts from across the galaxy, all looking at her like she had answers they needed. She opened her bag. "Scylla, there is dried meat in the cloth bundle. Eat slowly. Borith, sit down and let me look at that leg." She pulled out her first aid kit. "Dren, can you keep the fire going? Use the dead wood, not the green branches. Green wood makes too much smoke." They followed her instructions without question. As she worked on Borith's injured leg, a deep cut that needed cleaning and bandaging, Annie felt something shift in the air around them. These were not competitors anymore. They were survivors, bound together by a long night and a shared enemy in the monitoring station. Instructor Kolveth watched screen 44 with an expression that might have been fear. The human had faced a shade stalker and driven it away with fire and courage. Now she was building a team from broken, frightened recruits. He pulled up the file on Earth again. This time, he read deeper. Average surface gravity, 1.4 times galactic standard. Temperature range, -50 to +50 degrees. Native predators, numerous, including apex hunters capable of killing adult humans. Natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, floods. Earth was classified as a Category 4 death world. Humans had evolved there without genetic engineering, without advanced technology, without any of the advantages that other species took for granted. They had survived through sheer stubborn refusal to die. Kolveth looked at Annie Reyes on the screen, teaching aliens twice her size how to survive with rope and fire and knowledge. His scales went pale that he finally understood what he was looking at. Instructor Kolveth had not slept in 20 hours. He sat alone in the monitoring station, surrounded by screens showing recruits scattered across the simulated wilderness. Most of them were failing, but his eyes kept returning to screen 44. Annie Reyes had gathered 7 recruits around her now. 7 aliens from different species, different cultures, different worlds, all following a human who carried nothing but an old leather bag. Kolveth pulled up the Federation database and typed a single word: Earth. The information that filled his screen made his stomach turn. Earth was not just a death world. It was one of the most hostile planets in known space that had produced intelligent life. The database showed images of Earth predators, massive bears with claws like knives, cats that could run faster than most vehicles, serpents with venom that could kill in minutes. It showed images of Earth weather, spinning storms that destroyed entire cities, waves of water tall enough to swallow buildings, mountains that exploded without warning and buried everything in fire and ash. And through all of it, humans had survived. Not with advanced technology, not with genetic engineering, not with any of the tools that civilized species considered necessary for survival. They had survived with knowledge, with cooperation, with an endless, stubborn refusal to give up. Kolveth scrolled through more data. Humans could walk for days without rest. They could survive injuries that would kill most species. They could eat almost anything, drink water that other species would consider poison, and adapt to temperatures ranging from freezing to boiling. But the most remarkable thing was not their physical resilience. It was their social behavior. Humans formed groups. They shared resources. They taught each other skills. They protected the weak and cared for the injured. Even when resources were scarce, even when survival demanded selfishness, humans chose cooperation over competition. It made no logical sense. And yet it worked. Over millions of years, it had worked so well that humans had become the dominant species on their death world, spreading across every environment, conquering every challenge. Kolveth looked back at screen 44. Annie was teaching her group how to build traps for small animals. She demonstrated the technique once, then watched as each alien tried to copy her movements. When they made mistakes, she corrected them patiently. When they succeeded, she praised them. "You understand now," Borith the Grundothi said on the screen. "This is not just about surviving. This is about thriving. Every creature can survive alone for a little while, Annie replied. But together, we can survive forever. That is what my grandmother taught me. That is what humans have always known. Scylla the Pelcary held up her completed trap. Will this really catch food? It will catch small creatures, yes. Not enough for a full meal, but enough to keep your strength up. Annie smiled at her. Tomorrow I will show you how to find edible plants. The jungle has more food than you think, if you know where to look. Dren sat apart from the group, watching Annie with an expression that had changed completely from 2 days ago. The mockery was gone. In its place was something like wonder. Human, he said. Annie, why do you teach us? We are still your competitors. Every one of us who passes the assessment is someone you will have to face in future training. Annie looked at him. And every one of you who fails is someone who might have saved lives someday. Someone who might have protected innocent people. Someone who might have made the galaxy a little bit better. She shrugged. I would rather compete against strong rivals than win by default because everyone else died. The final night of the assessment arrived. Annie's group built a camp together, sharing the work and the watch. They had enough food, enough water, and enough warmth. They had something else too. Something that could not be measured or counted. They had become a team. In the monitoring station, Kolveth watched them sleep in shifts, taking turns to guard each other through the darkness. Other recruits on other screens huddled alone, cold and hungry and afraid. But on screen 44, 7 aliens rested peacefully around a fire, protected by walls they had built together. Kolveth made a decision. He pulled up the Academy records and began to type. Preliminary assessment notes. Recruit Reyes, Annie. Species, human. Homeworld, Earth, Category 4. Performance, exceptional. Recommendation, immediate advancement to specialized training. Additional notes. Human survival methodology should be studied and potentially integrated into standard academy curriculum. Previous assumptions about human capabilities were incorrect. Significantly incorrect. He paused, then added one more line. Humans are not weak. They are something else entirely. Something we do not yet have a word for. The simulation ended at dawn. The jungle flickered and faded, replaced by the smooth metal walls of the simulation bay. Annie stood with her group as the doors opened and Instructor Kolveth walked in. He looked at them, 7 aliens standing together, tired but unbroken, gathered around a small human woman with an old leather bag. His eyes met Annie's, and for the first time in 30 years, Instructor Kolveth felt something he had almost forgotten: respect. 3 days after the assessment ended, Annie Reyes stood outside Instructor Kolveth's office. Her leather bag hung at her side, same as always. She had cleaned it carefully, oiling the leather and checking every stitch. It was ready for whatever came next. The door slid open. Enter, Kolveth's deep voice commanded. Annie walked into the office. It was sparse and functional, decorated only with combat medals and a single image of what she assumed was Kolveth's homeworld, a harsh landscape of rocks and ice. The instructor sat behind a metal desk, his scarred armor gleaming in the artificial light. Sit, he said. Annie Saturday for a long moment. Kolveth simply looked at her. His expression was difficult to read, but something in his eyes had changed since the first day of orientation. You know, he said finally, in 30 years of training recruits, I have never passed a human. I know, sir. I believe humans were too soft, too fragile, too dependent on technology and comfort. He leaned forward. I was wrong. Annie said nothing. She waited. I watched your assessment footage many times, Kolveth continued. I watched you build shelters, start fires, purify water. I watched you treat injuries and share food with recruits who had mocked you. I watched you face a shadestalker with nothing but fire and courage. He paused. And I watched you teach 7 aliens how to survive using knowledge that your species developed over millions of years on one of the most hostile planets in known space. He stood up and walked around the desk, stopping in front of her. Tell me about the bag. Annie lifted the bag onto her lap. The leather was warm under her fingers, soft from decades of use. It belonged to my grandmother. Her name was Betty Reyes. She was a wilderness guide in Montana, which is a region on Earth with mountains and forests and cold winters. What made her carry this particular bag? She was 19 when she got lost in a blizzard. She was hiking alone, and the weather changed faster than she expected. She spent 3 days in the wilderness with nothing but what she had in her pockets. Annie traced the stitching. When she was finally rescued, She promised herself that she would never be unprepared again. She made this bag and filled it with everything she wished she had during those 3 days. And she carried it for 40 years. Yes, she added things over time, removed things that did not work, tested every item in real conditions. By the end of her life, this bag was perfect. Not perfect for everyone, perfect for someone who knew how to use it. Kolveth nodded slowly. And she passed it to you. Before she died, she said everything I needed was inside. Not just the tools, the knowledge. Annie looked up at him. She was right. The instructor was silent for a moment. Then he walked back to his desk and picked up a data pad. The Federation Combat Academy has existed for 400 years, he said. We have trained soldiers from 73 species. We have developed training programs based on the best military practices in the galaxy. And in all that time, we have never considered that the most valuable survival tool might be. He gestured at the bag. Low technology passed down through generations. Technology fails, and he said. Knowledge does not. Yes. Kolveth set down the data pad. Recruit Reyes, you achieved the highest survival score in Academy history. Your group had a 100% survival rate. 7 recruits who would have failed are now moving to advanced training because of what you taught them. Annie felt warmth spread through her chest, but she kept her expression calm. Thank you, sir. Do not thank me yet. A hint of what might have been a smile crossed Kolveth's face. I am recommending you for the elite training corps. It will be the most difficult year of your life, but I believe you are ready. He extended his hand, a human gesture, and he realized. He had learned it for her. She shook his hand. His grip was gentle, careful not to crush her smaller fingers. Your grandmother would be proud, he said. Annie nodded, not trusting her voice. She walked out of the office and found Dren, Scylla, and Borith waiting in the corridor. They rushed toward her, questions tumbling out in a mix of languages. What happened? Did he pass you? Are you staying? Annie smiled. I am staying. Elite Training Corps. Dren let out a roar of approval that echoed through the corridor. Scylla grabbed Annie's hands with all 4 of her own. Borith simply nodded, his Grundothi face solemn, but his eyes bright. We requested to form a permanent squad, Dren said. The 4 of us. They approved it this morning. Annie stared at them. You want to train with me? Long term. You saved our lives, Scylla said. You taught us things we did not know. You made us better. She squeezed Annie's hands. We want to learn more. For a moment, Annie could not speak. She thought of her grandmother, alone in that blizzard 40 years ago, dreaming of warmth and safety. She thought of all the people her grandmother had saved with nothing but knowledge and determination. She thought of the bag in her hands, worn and old and perfect. She opened it and pulled out her academy insignia. Carefully, she placed it inside the bag, next to her grandmother's old compass. Then let us get started, she said. They walked together down the corridor, for soldiers from 4 different worlds, following a human woman with an old leather bag. And somewhere in the monitoring station, Instructor Kolveth quietly updated the academy curriculum. A new course would be added next term. It would be called Human Survival Methodology. Somewhere across the galaxy, humanity had proven something important. The most dangerous weapon was not technology or strength or numbers. It was an old leather bag, a lifetime of knowledge, and the stubborn refusal to let anyone die alone. That was what it meant to be human. That was what it had always meant.